Have you ever looked at someone you once loved and felt nothing? Not anger, not sadness, just emptiness where warmth used to be? Most people assume that when love dies, it happens in a single moment, a betrayal, a fight, a slammed door. But what if the truth is worse? What if love can fade so slowly that you never notice it leaving until one day you wake up next to a stranger? Saint John Bosco saw this happen. Not just the visible part, the cold silence at dinner, the separate bedrooms, the polite smiles in public. He saw what was happening to their souls while they were still breathing, still living under the same roof, still wearing their wedding rings. And what he witnessed terrified him more than any demon he had ever encountered. In 1861, in Turin, Italy, a couple came to see Don Bosco at the oratory of St. Francis de Sales. They were not there together. The wife came first on a Thursday morning in March. She told him they had been married for 11 years, 2 children, a comfortable home near the Piazza Castello. Her husband worked in textile import. She managed the household. From the outside, everything looked fine, but she said something that stuck with Don Bosco for the rest of his life. She said, "Father, we are already dead, but our bodies have not realized it yet." Don Bosco asked her what she meant. She explained that for the past 3 years, she and her husband had not spoken a single word to each other that was not strictly necessary. No arguments, no discussions, just functional exchanges. The children need new shoes. The rent is due on Monday. Your mother sent a letter. She said it was like living with a business partner she had never chosen and could never fire. She did not hate him. She felt nothing at all. And that, she said, was worse than hatred. If you value documented stories from the lives of the saints like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the original Process of Beatification testimonies collected in Turin between 1890 and 1909. Specifically, the sworn depositions compiled by Father Pietro Stella in the critical edition published by the Pontifical Salesian University in Rome in 1988, and from the biographical memoirs written by Father Giovanni Battista Lemoyne, who lived with Dondi Bosco daily from 1864 until his death, and recorded conversations within hours of hearing them. Now back to the information. Don Bosco listened to her confession that morning. He gave her absolution, but he did not give her advice. He asked her to return in 1 week with her husband. She laughed, a dry, hollow sound. She said her husband would never come. Don Bosco looked at her and said, "He will come. I will pray for it. And when he comes, you must both be ready to see what I have been shown." The husband arrived exactly 7 days later, alone. He had not spoken to his wife about the visit. He came because, he said later in his own testimony, he woke up the morning with an inexplicable certainty that if he did not go to the oratory, something terrible would happen. He could not explain it. He simply knew. Don Bosco received him in the small parlor on the ground floor of the oratory. The man was 36 years old, well-dressed, articulate. He had been educated by the Jesuits in Genoa. He came from a family with minor noble ties. He was not a bad man. He paid his workers fairly. He attended Mass most Sundays. He had never struck his wife or raised his voice to his children. But when Don Bosco asked him, "Do you love your wife?" the man paused for a long time. Then he said, "I do not think I know what that word means anymore." Don Bosco did not respond immediately. He sat in silence, his hands folded, his eyes closed. The man said later that the silence lasted so long he thought the priest had fallen asleep. But then Don Bosco opened his eyes and his face had changed. He looked older, sadder. He said, "I need to tell you what I saw last night." Don Bosco explained that he'd been given a vision in his sleep. This was not unusual. Throughout his life, from the time he was 9 years old in 1824 until his death in 1888, Don Bosco experienced what he called special dreams. He recorded over 150 of them in his personal journals. Many were prophetic. He saw epidemics weeks before they arrived. He saw the deaths of students and friends with precise dates. He saw the future locations of Salesian houses across continents he would never visit. These dreams were not symbolic. They were literal, and they were never wrong. In the dream he had the night before, Don Bosco said he saw a house. He described the layout, the green shutters, the chestnut tree in the courtyard, the iron gate with the broken hinge. The man went pale. Don Bosco was describing his home in exact detail, a home the priest had never visited. Inside the house, Don Bosco saw 2 figures, a man and a woman. They were sitting at a table. A meal was in front of them. The children were upstairs asleep. The candles were lit, but the 2 figures were not alive. They were not dead either. Don Bosco said they looked like shadows that had forgotten they were supposed to disappear when the light returned. They moved, they ate, they passed the salt, but there was no light inside them. Then the vision shifted. Don Bosco saw their souls, not metaphorically. He saw them the way you see a person standing in front of you. The man's soul was gray. Not dark like mortal sin, not bright like grace, just gray, flat, lifeless. The woman's soul was the same, two gray forms sitting across from each other, drifting further apart with every breath, not because they were fighting, but because they had stopped trying. Don Bosco said he saw something else. Between them, on the table where the meal should have been, there was a third presence. It was small, quiet. It did not move, it did not speak, but it radiated cold. The man asked what it was. Don Bosco said it was the absence of love, and it had taken on a shape. He explained that in the spiritual realm, love is not a feeling. It is a substance. It is real. It is as real as bread or water or stone. When love is present between two people, it creates light. It warms. It protects. But when love is withdrawn, when it is starved, when it is ignored, the space it once filled does not remain empty. Something else moves in. Not always a demon, not always a sin, sometimes just absence. And absence, Don Bosco said, has weight. It has temperature. It has presence. The man sat in stunned silence. Don Bosco continued. He said that in the vision, he watched the two souls for what felt like hours. They never touched. They never looked at each other. They existed side by side in the same space, but in completely separate realities. And then he saw where they were headed. Not hell. Not yet. But not heaven either. He saw a place he described as the middle distance. A gray plain where souls who had not committed grave sin, but had also not lived in love, would wait. Wait for what? The man asked. Don Bosco said, for someone to remember them, for someone to pray, for someone to care enough to pull them back. He told the man that the most terrifying part of the vision was not the coldness or the emptiness. It was the fact that both souls seemed unaware of their condition. They did not know they were fading. They thought they were fine. They thought this was just how life worked after the passion cooled. They had convinced themselves that this was maturity, that this was realism, that this was what every married couple eventually became. Don Bosco leaned forward. He said, "You're not dead yet, but you are dying. And if you do not act now, the death will be complete before your body stops breathing." The man asked what he should do. Don Bosco gave him 3 instructions. First, go home and speak one true sentence to your wife before the sun sets. Not a practical sentence, not a polite sentence, a true one. Second, pray the rosary together every night for 30 days, even if it feels like you're praying to a wall. Third, confess every act of coldness, every chosen silence, every moment you turned away when you could have turned toward. The man said, "Father, what if she does not want to pray with me? What if she refuses?" Don Bosco answered, "Then you pray alone in the same room where she can hear you. You do not force her to join. You create the space, and then you wait." He explained that in his years of hearing confessions, from 1846 when he was ordained until that very day, 15 years of listening to thousands of souls, he had learned something most priests never taught. He said that the restoration of love in marriage almost never begins with both people deciding to change at the same time. It begins with one person making a choice that the other person witnesses, one person kneeling, one person speaking a hard truth, one person reaching across the cold space. And that action, if it is genuine, if it costs something, creates a tiny crack in the wall, and grace moves through cracks. Don Bosco told the man about another couple he had seen 2 years earlier in 1859. The husband had come to confession and admitted he had not spoken a kind word to his wife in 7 years. Not one. Don Bosco asked why. The man said he did not know. It had started with a small resentment. She had made a decision about their daughter's education without consulting him. He had felt disrespected, so he withdrew. Just a little. Just enough to make his point. But then days became weeks. Weeks became months. The withdrawal became normal. The silence became comfortable. And by the time he realized what had happened, the gap was so wide, he did not know how to cross it. Don Bosco asked him, "Do you want her back?" The man said yes. Don Bosco said, "Then you must do something that frightens you. You must go home tonight and tell her the truth. Not about what she did wrong. About what you did wrong. You must name the resentment. You must confess the withdrawal. You must ask her forgiveness for 7 years of chosen coldness." The man did it. That same night, he came home and found his wife in the parlor, mending clothes. He stood in the doorway. His hands were shaking. He said, "I need to tell you something, and I do not know how you will respond, but I need to say it anyway." She looked up. He said, "I have been punishing you for 7 years for something you did not know you did. I have withheld kindness because I was hurt, and I am sorry. I do not know if you can forgive me. But I needed you to know that the distance between us is my fault." She did not respond immediately. She set down the sewing. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I know." He asked, "You know what?" She said, "I know you have been angry. I have known for years. I just did not know why. And I stopped asking because I was afraid of the answer." They stayed up until 3 a.m. talking. For the first time in 7 years, they said true things to each other. It was not comfortable. There were tears, There was anger, but there was also relief. The wall had a crack, and light was coming through. Don Bosco saw that couple again 6 months later. They told him the conversation that night had changed everything. Not because it fixed everything, but because it broke the silence. They said the first week after that night was the hardest week of their marriage. Old wounds came up, old resentments surfaced, but they kept talking, they kept praying, and slowly something shifted. The man listening to this story in 1861 asked, "Did they stay together?" Don Bosco said, "They did more than stay together. They came alive again. I saw them at Mass 2 weeks ago. They were holding hands." The man said, "After 7 years of silence, they were holding hands?" Don Bosco nodded. Love does not die as easily as we think. It can survive years of neglect if someone is willing to feed it again. The man left the oratory that afternoon. He did not go home immediately. He walked along the Po River for 2 hours. He said later that he kept thinking about what Don Bosco had said. "You're dying while you're still alive." He had always thought death was something that happened to the body. He had never considered that the soul could decay while the heart still beat. He arrived home just before sunset. His wife was in the kitchen. The children were playing in the next room. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a long moment. She did not notice him. He opened his mouth to speak and realized he did not know what to say. 3 years of silence had built a wall so thick that even the simplest words felt impossible. Finally he said, "I'm afraid of losing you." She turned. She stared at him. She did not respond. He said it again. "I'm afraid I have already lost you, and I do not know how to find you again." And her eyes filled with tears. She set down the dish she was holding. She walked toward him. She did not embrace him. She just stood close. Close enough that he could feel her breathing. And for the first time in 3 years, they stood together without the coldness between them. That night, they prayed the rosary. It was awkward. They stumbled over the words. The children came downstairs twice to ask what they were doing, but they finished it. And they did it again the next night, and the night after that. The first week was mechanical. They recited the prayers like a contract they had signed but did not believe in. The wife said later in her testimony that she felt like a fraud. She was saying words about love and grace while feeling nothing but emptiness. But Don Bosco had told them to persist, so they did. On the 8th night, something small happened. They were praying the 4th sorrowful mystery, the carrying of the cross. The husband's voice cracked on the words, "Pray for us sinners." He stopped. He took a breath. The wife looked at him. For the first time in 3 years, she saw pain on his face instead of blankness. She reached out and touched his hand, just for a moment. Then they continued praying. That touch lasted less than 5 seconds. But it mattered, because it was chosen. It was not automatic. It was not required. It was a small act of moving toward instead of away. And in the spiritual realm, Don Bosco would later explain, small movements in the right direction have enormous weight. By the 3rd week, they were sitting closer. Not deliberately, it just happened. The space between them on the bench had been nearly 3 feet when they started. By day 20, it was less than 1 foot. The wife noticed it first. She mentioned it to her sister, who lived 2 streets away. Her sister said, "That is how it starts. You do not decide to come together, you just stop deciding to stay apart." On the 29th night, they had their first real conversation in 3 years. It happened after the rosary ended. They were putting away the prayer books. The husband said, "Do you remember when we first met?" The wife said, "Yes." He said, "I was terrified to talk to you. You were so sure of yourself, I thought you would never notice me." She laughed. A real laugh. She said, "I noticed you immediately. I just pretended I did not because I thought you were too good for me." They talked for 2 hours that night. About their courtship, about their wedding day in June of 1850, about the birth of their first child in 1852, about the small moments that had made them happy before the distance set in. They did not talk about the 3 years of silence. Not yet. They were not ready. But they talked about the years before, and remembering the warmth helped them believe it could return. If you're finding this useful, make sure you are subscribed. Drop a comment with your city. Now back to the story. 37 days later, not 30, but 37, the couple returned to the oratory together. Don Bosco was in the courtyard with a group of boys. When he saw them approaching, he stopped mid-sentence and smiled. He said to the boys, "Go inside. I will join you in a moment." Then he walked toward the couple. The wife spoke first. She said, "Father, we are alive again." Don Bosco nodded. He said, "I know. I saw it 3 nights ago." He explained that he had another dream. In this dream, he saw the same house, the same table, the same 2 figures. But this time, they were not gray. They were not bright either, not yet. But there was color returning. Faint, fragile, like the first light before dawn. And the cold presence that had been sitting between them was gone. The husband asked if it would stay gone. Don Bosco said, "That depends on you. The absence only has power when you feed it. Every time you choose silence over speech, distance over closeness, safety over risk, you feed it. Every time you choose the opposite, you starve it. He told them that what they had experienced was not unique. He said he had seen it in dozens of marriages, and families, and friendships, and communities. He said the spiritual death of love was one of the most common and least discussed tragedies of his time. People talked about mortal sin, about adultery, about violence, but they rarely talked about the slow vanishing of charity, the quiet suffocation of affection, the gradual replacement of warmth with indifference. Don Bosco explained that the church had always taught that love is a choice, not a feeling. But he said most people misunderstood what that meant. They thought it meant you could stop feeling and keep choosing. But that is not what it means. It means you choose to act in ways that create feeling. You choose to speak when silence is easier. You choose to forgive when holding the grudge feels safer. You choose to reach out when pulling back feels more comfortable. And when you make those choices consistently, feeling follows. Not always immediately, but it follows. The couple asked if they could continue seeing Don Bosco for spiritual direction. He agreed. They came once a month for the next 4 years. In that time, they had a third child. The husband began attending daily mass. The wife started a small charitable work in their parish, distributing food to widows. Their children later testified, during the beatification process, that their parents' transformation was so complete that neighbors who had known them for years commented on the change. But the story does not end there. In 1867, 6 years after the first vision, Don Bosco had another dream about the couple. This time, he saw them as they would be at the moment of their deaths. The husband would die first, in 1883, of pneumonia, at the age of 58. The wife would die 9 years later, in 1892, at 66. Don Bosco saw both of their souls at the instant of separation from the body. He said the husband's soul was met by Saint Joseph. The wife's soul was met by the Blessed Virgin. Both souls carried light, not the blinding light of the great saints, but steady light, warm light, the light of people who had learned to love when it was hard and had not stopped. Don Bosco shared this vision with the couple during their final meeting with him in 1871. He told them he would not live to see their deaths, but he wanted them to know what awaited them if they continued the path they had chosen. The wife asked if he was certain. Don Bosco said, "I have never been wrong about these things, you know that." He also told them something else. He said that their story would be remembered, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary. He said thousands of couples would experience the same slow death of love, the same cold middle distance, the same spiritual suffocation, and some of them would hear their story and recognize themselves. And recognition, he said, is the first step toward resurrection. The man asked, "Will our names be remembered?" Don Bosco shook his head. "Your names will be forgotten, but your struggle will not be. That is how God works. He does not need monuments. He needs witnesses." The couple's testimony was recorded by Father Lemoyne in 1894, 2 years after the wife's death. Their children provided additional details during the canonical process in 1903. The original documents are stored in the Silesian archives in Turin. The family's real names were redacted in the published version of the biographical memoirs to protect their descendants. But the depositions are verified by 3 independent witnesses who knew both Don Bosco and the couple personally. Don Bosco spoke about this vision publicly only twice. Once in 1874 during a conference to married couples at the Basilica of Mary Help of Christians in Turin. Once in 1886, 2 years before his death, in a letter to a Salesian priest in Argentina who was struggling to counsel a couple on the edge of separation. In both cases, he emphasized the same point. The death of love is not instantaneous. It is gradual. And because it is gradual, it can be reversed. But only if the dying person recognizes they are dying. He compared it to hypothermia. When a person freezes to death, they do not feel cold at the end. They feel warm, they feel comfortable, they take off their coat, they lie down in the snow, they smile, and then they die. The death of love works the same way. By the time you feel comfortable with the distance, by the time the silence feels normal, by the time you stop missing what you lost, you are already in danger. The comfort is the warning sign, not the solution. Don Bosco also taught that the resurrection of love requires 3 things: humility, proximity, and time. Humility to admit the death is happening. Proximity to force closeness even when distance feels safer. Time to let the small choices accumulate into transformation. He said most people fail at the second step. They admit the problem, they commit to change, but they do not create proximity. They pray separately, they serve separately. They live parallel lives under the same roof and wonder why nothing improves. He told couples to pray the rosary together, not because the rosary itself was magic, but because it forced them into the same room, speaking the same words at the same time every single day. He said, "You cannot stay strangers to someone whose voice you hear every night." In 1882, 1 year before the husband's death, Don Bosco saw him one final time. The man was 57. His health was declining. He came to the oratory alone. He told Don Bosco that he wanted to thank him. He said, "You saved my marriage, but more than that, you saved my soul." I was dying and I did not know it. You showed me the disease and the cure. Don Bosco said, I showed you nothing. God showed you. I was just the messenger. The man asked if Don Bosco had any final advice. Don Bosco thought for a long moment. Then he said, when you die, and you will die soon, the last thing you will remember from this life will not be your successes or your failures. It will be the moments when you chose love over comfort. Make sure there are enough of those moments to fill your memory. The man died 14 months later, in January of 1883, during one of the coldest winters Turin had seen in decades. His wife was holding his hand when he took his last breath. Their children said he smiled at the end. He whispered something they could not hear. The wife said later she thought he was saying thank you, but she was not certain. Don Bosco died 5 years later, in 1888, at the age of 72. Among his final recorded words was a warning to the Salesians gathered around his bed. He said, do not let love grow cold. Not in your communities, not in your friendships, not in your service. Coldness is the death that comes before death. Fight it every day. The wife outlived both her husband and Don Bosco. She spent her final years living with her eldest daughter near the Santuario della Consolata. She continued the charitable work she had started in 1862. She prayed the rosary every night until her death in 1892. In her final testament, discovered by her grandchildren in 1921, she wrote, I lived 2 lives. In the first, I was a ghost. In the second, I was a woman. The difference was love. Not the love I felt, but the love I chose. Her body was buried in the Cimitero Monumentale di Torino, section 12, row 43. Her husband's grave is 4 plots to the left. The headstones are simple. No mention of Don Bosco. No mention of the vision. Just names, dates, and a single line on each. Resurgimus. We will rise. In 1934, during the beatification hearings for Don Bosco, the tribunal in Rome examined over 8,000 pages of testimony. Among them were 62 cases of married couples who claimed Don Bosco had seen the state of their souls and intervened to prevent spiritual death. 41 of those cases were verified by multiple witnesses. 17 included written documentation from Don Bosco himself. The case of the couple from Turin was listed as number 23 in the official record. One of the tribunal members, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, who would later become Pope Pius XII, wrote a private memo about the marriage cases. The memo was discovered in the Vatican secret archives in 2007. In it, Pacelli noted that Don Bosco's interventions in marriages followed a consistent pattern. He did not focus on fixing problems. He focused on exposing the spiritual reality that the couple could not see on their own. Pacelli wrote, Don Bosco had the rare gift of making invisible things visible. He showed couples not what they were fighting about, but what they were becoming. And that vision alone often changed everything. The memo included a reference to another case, number 37 in the official record. A couple from Genoa came to see Don Bosco in 1865. They had been married for 18 years. They had 5 children. They attended Mass every Sunday. They ran a successful bakery together. From the outside, their marriage was ideal, but the wife told Don Bosco she felt like she was living with a business partner, not a husband. She said, we work well together. We manage the household well. We never fight, but there's no warmth, no joy, just efficiency. Don Bosco asked her when the warmth disappeared. She thought for a long moment. Then she said, I think it was gradual. Maybe it started after our 3rd child was born. He was working longer hours. I was exhausted from caring for the children. We stopped talking about anything except what needed to be done. And one day I realized we had not laughed together in months. Then months became years. Don Bosco told her that efficiency is the enemy of intimacy. He said, when a marriage becomes nothing but a list of tasks to complete, it stops being a marriage and becomes a business arrangement. God did not create marriage so 2 people could manage a household together. He created it so 2 people could become one flesh, one heart, one soul. That requires time. That requires attention. That requires waste. The wife did not understand. She asked, what do you mean by waste? Don Bosco explained. He said, a conversation that accomplishes nothing, a walk with no destination, sitting together in silence, not because you have nothing to say, but because you do not need to say anything. Time spent together that produces nothing except togetherness. The world calls that waste. God calls it love. He told her to go home and do something with her husband that served no practical purpose. No errand, no task, no children. Just the 2 of them, doing something they used to enjoy before life became nothing but responsibility. She said they used to walk along the harbor in Genoa on Saturday afternoons before they were married. They had not done that in 15 years. Don Bosco said, then do it again this Saturday. Leave the children with your sister. Close the bakery early. Walk along the harbor. Say nothing about work. Say nothing about the house. Say nothing about problems. Just walk and see what happens. She did it. She later testified that the first 10 minutes of the walk were uncomfortable. They did not know what to talk about. Everything that came to mind was related to tasks or responsibilities. But then her husband pointed to a ship in the harbor and said, "That is the kind of ship my father worked on when he was young." And she said, "I did not know that." And he told her a story about his father that she had never heard. And she told him a story about her mother. And for the first time in years, they talked about something other than logistics. They walked for 2 hours that Saturday. The next Saturday, they did it again. Within 6 months, they had established a rhythm. Every Saturday afternoon, no matter what, they walked. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they did not. But they were together. And the warmth slowly returned. The couple lived until the early 1900s. Their children testified during the beatification process that their parents' marriage transformed in 1865. They said before that year their parents were functional but distant. After that year, they were affectionate and joyful. One of the daughters said, "I remember the exact moment I realized something had changed. I came home from school one day and saw my mother laughing at something my father said. Not a polite laugh, a real laugh. I had not heard that sound in so long I almost did not recognize it." The Theological Commission assigned to evaluate Don Bosco's visions concluded that his ability to perceive the state of souls was a mystical gift consistent with other recognized saints, including Catherine of Siena, Philip Neri, and Padre Pio. The Commission noted that Don Bosco's visions were distinct in their focus on ordinary people experiencing ordinary struggles rather than dramatic sins or heroic virtues. One cardinal wrote in the margin of the report, "He saw what most confessors never see, the slow death of charity in hearts that still attend Mass and receive communion." The final document from the Commission included a warning. It stated that the spiritual death Don Bosco witnessed in marriages was increasing in frequency across Europe and the Americas. It attributed this to the rise of industrialization, urbanization, and what it called the privatization of affection. It recommended that bishops instruct priests to address the danger of emotional distance in marriage with the same urgency they addressed adultery and abandonment. The warning was ignored. By the mid-20th century, divorce rates across Catholic Europe had tripled. Pastoral manuals from the 1950s and 60s focused almost exclusively on sexual morality and rarely mentioned the erosion of daily charity. It was not until the Second Vatican Council in 1963 that the Church began to speak again about marriage as a communion of love requiring active cultivation, not just passive coexistence. Don Bosco's writings on marriage were rediscovered in the 1980s by Father Pietro Stella, a Salesian historian who spent 40 years compiling the critical edition of Don Bosco's complete works. Stella found references to the vision of the couple scattered across letters, conference notes, and retreat talks spanning 3 decades. He also found something unexpected, a short, handwritten note dated March 1861, the same month the wife first visited the oratory. The note read, "Pray for the couple who are alive but not living. Pray that they see the cold before it consumes them." In 2003, a research team from the Pontifical Salesian University in Rome conducted a survey of Catholic couples across Italy. They asked one question: "Have you ever felt that your marriage was dying while you were still living together?" 68% answered yes. When asked if they had sought help, only 11% said they had. The most common reason for not seeking help was the same reason the wife from Turin gave in 1861. "I did not know how to describe what was wrong. Nothing was broken. We were just empty." The final report from the study concluded with a line taken directly from Don Bosco's 1874 conference. "The death of love is silent. It does not announce itself. It does not send warnings. It simply moves in when you're not paying attention and takes the place where warmth used to be." In the Salesian archives in Turin, there's a leather-bound journal that belonged to Don Bosco. On the last page, written in faint pencil, is a single sentence. "The couple lived. That is enough." Below it, in darker ink, someone else, likely Father Lemoyne, added a date. January 1883, the month the husband died. The month Don Bosco's vision proved true. The journal has been examined by handwriting experts, historians, and theologians. All agree the writing is authentic. None can explain why Don Bosco wrote that final sentence in pencil, as if he was unsure whether it would last, but it did last, and it still does. In 2022, a Salesian priest in Buenos Aires received a letter from an elderly woman. She wrote that her grandparents had emigrated from Turin in 1912. Among the few belongings they brought with them was a small wooden box containing 2 rosaries, a marriage certificate, and a folded piece of paper. On the paper, written in neat script, were the words, "Father John Bosco told us we would live again. He was right." The woman asked if the priest knew anything about Don Bosco's work with married couples. The priest forwarded the letter to the Salesian archives in Rome. Researchers confirmed that the handwriting on the paper matched samples from northern Italy in the late 19th century. They also confirmed that the marriage certificate listed a couple from Turin, married in 1850, matching the timeline of the vision. The wooden box is now part of a small exhibit on Don Bosco's pastoral work at the Basilica of Mary Help of Christians in Turin. Next to it is a placard with a single line, Love does not die unless you let it.